the Center for Hawaiian Studies was beginning to be built around. I was in complete ignorance of these things. I was really a part of a group of musicians who've been performing Hawaiian music and writing songs in English about the Hawaiian plight back in the 1970s. And we'd been writing about things like Ho'olave, written about evictions and Hawaiians trying to reach back for the land. But we were fundamentally really separated from any kind of intimate knowledge of our people, our traditions, our history, and certainly, and most importantly, our language. Many of us, and this would be true, by the way, for people like Robert Casimiro and others who have become fluent in the language and fluent in the dance, many of us really were not we were not able, we were almost mute in our own language in the 1970s. Even as we were singing these songs and performing them, we didn't really know what they were about. We were almost in some ways holding a place, repeating songs that had been sung by our parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents, sort of keeping them alive until the time when, another generation perhaps would come along and really tell us and show us what those songs were about. Mentioning the people like Dr. Trask and Kayla Nicola and Kanu, I want to just, because we don't have a lot of time, talk a little bit about why they are important and relevant. I think to everyone in this room, people who live in this society now, we are in some ways, a generation preparing to leave a legacy behind, although Nicola would be just really offended if she heard me say that about her. But she should be, and perhaps we are, and as I look at all the young faces here are some things that I think you might want to know about what I think about these individuals and why they are so important to Hawaii as a place, as a society that is more than a society of Kanaka Maoli, more than a place for Native Hawaiians, but really a place where an amazing things happened. Haunani K. Trask was and I think continues to be a symbol of real defiance against very, very powerful and older kind of way of doing business in the territory in the state of Hawaii. She came from a family of politicians. Her uncle and her father and her grandfather were all really prominent parts of people, individuals who back in the 1930s and 1940s and 50s were moving and working towards statehood. They were Kanaka Maoli, they were Hawaiian men and women who were anxious to secure statehood because of the really inferior place that people in Hawaii, local people in Hawaiians, occupied under a territorial status. Unable to elect our own governor, really dependent on presidential appointees of governors who could veto legislation at will, and those governors were almost always conservative, tied to the sugar industry, and for very many years living in a place where the Republican Party, big sugar, money, really controlled elections in Hawaii, 1930s and 1940s. So that labor itself, the labor movements were continually suppressed, not successfully ultimately, obviously, but continually held down by the political power that existed here in the hands of Republicans and sugar people. She comes from that background. Her family talked about these things all of the time in her presence. She grew up with just an incredible anger and hostility toward individuals and people who occupied positions of power, but but then used it basically to promote themselves, their friends, the coterie of individuals around them, their family members, and basically ignored the public, ignored, the desire of people. She spoke for Hawaiians primarily, but she was always speaking from that sense of railing against this unfairness and injustice. And it's one of the things that I always admired. She never retreated from that. One of the reasons why she was a particular kind of feminist, not just a feminist, but a Kanaka Maoli woman, a feminist, a person who really struggled to get people to understand not just that women wanted a fair shake, but that women really were asserting their superiority in a number of different realms. Their ability to be compassionate, their ability to think in terms of community. So when I think of Haunanike, I think about her defiance and what it cost her. Because she was also, in return for that defiance, she was painted with every ugly picture that politicians and social commentators could bring to bear. An angry woman, almost as though it was one word. Why is she so hostile? She hates tourists. She hates others. All of these things were thrown at her door, but she was really very consistent. She was really very consistent about the object of her anger, and it was always people in power who misused it. So that's one. Nicola was the example of someone who nested herself in an aspect of our knowledge, in genealogies, in mo'oku auhau, in chiefly genealogies, and became so intimately connected with them, and so intimately knowledgeable about them. Today, I think she is really one of the living treasures in her knowledge of these genealogies and her understanding of how these families for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years lived with one another, contested with one another, argued, fought, loved, all of these things. She's a repository of all of these stories. And what they have become to her is really the importance of preserving those stories, that voice, that history, because they really were in such danger of simply being forgotten. After thousands of years of memorizing these genealogies and keeping intact our knowledge of ancestors, the 19th and 20th century almost brought that knowledge to an end. Even though it had been written out, even though they had been written down by people like Hornander, even though they were there in a written form, they were no longer seen by many people as relevant. And partly because of the work that she's done, the academic work, the advocacy that she's done, we see today the importance not just of knowing your ancestry, but the importance of knowing everything that you can know about your past and the past of your people. The importance of stepping away from what has become a really modern discourse, which is that you can be anything you want to be. You can be whatever you want to be. You don't have to be held back, and that's often how it's portrayed. You don't have to be held back by your past. You don't have to be held back by the mistakes that your ancestors made. You can reinvent yourself. Kanaka Maoli today are really insistent and more insistent that people should know where they come from. That it is not a drag upon your identity or on your career or your possibilities. That actually what it does is it gives you a foundation. It gives you a sense of belonging. It gives you a sense of purpose. This is, I think, one of the things, again, another thing that I knew nothing about when I wrote that song. And the third person is, as a young man, as a teenager, he dove headfirst into shallow water at Doris Duke's. He broke his neck. He was paralyzed, not completely, but very much, really, from the neck down, for the rest of his life. He spent quite a few years after therapy and recovery, basically as an alcoholic, drug abuser, angry, extremely disillusioned. He'd been athletic, musical, he played the ukulele, mischievous young man who is now confined to a wheelchair and dependence on others for the rest of his life. It was a hard thing for him to deal with. He went back to school and then got an MS degree in counseling. Decided that what he should do is devote. He basically picked. He picked a mission for himself because he knew that without that he would die. He would kill himself. He needed to have something to work for, so he picked counseling. He graduated and he did counseling, especially, and counseling and advocacy, something that actually he continued to do for the rest of his life, but especially for people who were, who were disabled. He was particularly compassionate with people who were in a similar situation to his. Young people who were incapacitated in that fashion. And he knew the horror of living through that until you could finally find some peace. But when I knew him, he had decided that he couldn't do that kind of work anymore, that it was too painful, that it wasn't something that really gave his spirit life. So here, he had decided to go back to school and become a historian. When I met him, we were both MA students in Pacific Island history. And I remember sitting next to him, the first time I ever met him, sitting next to him, and he was, taking notes with a pencil in his mouth and writing on this tablet. He typed his papers out as a graduate student using a kind of a stylus, and he would type it out on a Selectric. I saw how long it took for him to do that kind of work. Eventually, technology, he got a drag and dictate. He was like one of the first people, I think, in the university to have that kind of technology for himself. But I mean, honestly, this is a person who was completely driven at that point by just a love of learning and reading and thinking about and talking about all of these old stories. Became a magnificent historian. His writing is elegant, beautiful, compassionate, strange in some ways, imaginative. But here's how I want to end this. The thing that was important about Kanu was his voice. He had try and imagine a person who really could only move his arms slightly to do certain kinds of things, had no movement over his legs or the rest of his body, really. How does a person command attention? He did it with his voice. When Kanu spoke, people listened. When he learned to chant. And he loved to chant. And sometimes he would start off in the morning and he would chant in this little ahu right outside of his door to prepare himself for the day. But he used his voice so effectively that there were times when you absolutely forgot that he was disabled. This is a true thing. I said it at his funeral. We would come to the double doors of the building together sometimes. We'd be walking up to them, and I'd be behind and almost be waiting for him to open the door. There's a point where you just stop thinking of a person as handicapped or disabled. Then my favorite story of his was told by a graduate student, Ron Williams. Kanu had a motorized wheelchair, so he didn't need anybody to push him. But a lot of times, when he was going someplace, people would accompany him because he would ride himself over to Hamilton, and a graduate student would love to sort of hang around and just see what he had to hear what he had to say on that long walk. So they're off together. Ron Williams, tall, gangly, sort of shy Howley man, next to Kanu. And as they're walking, a skateboarder came by from behind them and ran into Kanu and sort of jostled him, and then kind of looked and then just kept going. And Kanu yells out, "Hey, punk! Get back here! I'm gonna kick your ass!" And Ron tells the story thinking, I wonder if it meant that I was going to have to kick his ass. But the guy came back and apologized. Kanu never lost sight of the fact that there were things that you have control over. And one of the most important things for Kanu was his voice. When he died really because he couldn't speak anymore. He had lost really the ability to speak, and at that point he lost the desire to continue on. So my last kind of remembrance is this. We have all been given a voice. For some people, it is all we have. And in some ways, for people who come from oppressed communities, you don't have money, you don't have connections, you don't have power, but you still have a voice. You dare not use that voice, and you dare not fail to use that voice. You must. You must speak. You always must. If we keep those things in mind. Thanks for I'm going to play one more song. I know it's getting late, but that's all right. So I did this for Kanu because, and for Nicola, and for